Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those of you who are on the West Coast. My name is Meg McBride on behalf of CNA and the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. We'd like to welcome you all to this event exploring the impacts of mis and disinformation on emergency management efforts during the upcoming hurricane season. As a bit of background, CNA is an independent, nonprofit, and nonpartisan research and analysis organization dedicated to the safety and security of the nation. We develop actionable solutions to complex problems of national importance. We're working in both national defense and homeland security defense. We operate the Center for Naval Analyses, the only federally funded research and development center serving the Department of the Navy, as well as the Institute for Public Research, which serves a range of organizations, including the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and FEMA. Our co-host for today's event is the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, also the DFR Lab, which has operationalized the study of disinformation by exposing falsehoods and fake news, documenting human rights abuses, and building digital resilience worldwide. This panel brings together two distinct lines of effort that are worth highlighting. So we've long been involved in emergency management space at the local, state, and federal levels, with a focus on planning, operations, and after actions of complex disasters. CNA supported consequence management of disasters from train derailments to tornadoes to cyber attacks. Over the last 20 years, we've been involved with the response to and recovery from every large hurricane, tackling topics such as medical and general population evacuation, emergency sheltering, debris management, life-saving and life-sustaining operations, incident coordination, and public information and warning. More recently, we've been working on a range of issues related to the challenges posed by mis and disinformation. We've completed studies on why people are vulnerable to this content, what the evidence-based research tells us about countermeasures that work, and a best practices guide for those who are in communication roles. And right now, we're actually conducting a study to evaluate what combination of interventions is most effective in increasing our resilience to mis and disinformation. So before we kick off today, a few housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to note that the opinions expressed during this event do not necessarily represent those are, let me go back. The opinions represented during this event are those of the guests and do not necessarily represent the opinions or views of CNA. The research provided by the speaker, the presenter, is for general informational purposes only. Additionally, as this is a Zoom webinar, you should enter your questions into the box labeled questions. We'll have dedicated time for our panelists to receive questions from the audience and answer them directly. And so now I'd like to kick us off. We have some fantastic panelists today, and I'm going to give each of them a few moments to introduce themselves and share any preliminary thoughts they have on this topic. And then we're going to jump in with our first question. We're joined today by, I'm gonna actually read everybody's names, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Andy, who's our first speaker, and we'll sort of go through the panelists at that point. By Andy Carvin, who's the research director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. By Kristen Hogan Schildwachter, the external affairs director for the City and County of San Francisco Department of Emergency Management. By Dr. Kim Cloko-McLean, a senior social scientist with the National Weather Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Dawn Thomas, the co-director of emergency management operations at CNA. And Heidi Holtz, a senior research scientist with the China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs team at CNA. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andy to kick us off.
Thanks, I really appreciate it. It's great seeing all of you today. Thanks for joining us. It's a real honor to be here. And in some ways, this feels like a bit of a professional homecoming for me. I've been at the DFR lab for about 5 years now, where I run a team of disinformation researchers around the world. And before that, I ran the social media desk at NPR. But way back in the day, I started my career working in internet policy and found myself involved in several opportunities to work with volunteers to respond to various disasters. The very first one was actually September 11th, 2001. In the aftermath of the attacks, it became pretty clear that the media, as well as the internet, were struggling to understand what had just happened and why. And so I formed an online community called September 11 Info, which for the next 48 hours or so was almost used like the equivalent of Twitter, with people posting minute by minute to this email list, trying to answer questions, better understand what's going on, because there weren't any mechanisms on the internet at that time for doing so. Um, as the years went by, the tools became more numerous, but information and misinformation became more numerous as well. If you fast forwarded to events such as Hurricane Gustav, the Haiti quake in about 15 years ago, what you would often find is lots of well-meaning people trying to get to the bottom of the situation, but not always knowing what on earth is going on. And each time you have to figure out a snap-second judgment as to what information you rely on and what you can't. And so as social media has become so dominant in public discourse, it's become vital that people who work in emergency management, first responders, and others have enough social media literacy, if you will, to prepare ahead for the potential mis and disinformation that circulate online. Because not only is there more of it out there, I think you could also make the argument that the ratio of well-meaning misinformation to more nefarious disinformation is is becoming closer and closer. Uh, and so it's become incumbent upon all of us to develop strategies for not only knowing how to communicate when a disaster strikes, but having the conversation started before it even begins, because you need the public trusting you and on your side, and seeing you as an honest broker and a trusted resource that's looking out for their safety. So thanks again for having me, and really looking forward to the conversation today.
So I think next we go over to Kristen.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you all for having me. Again, my name is Kristen Hogan Schildwachter, and I'm the External Affairs Director and Chief Communications Officer with the Department of Emergency Management at San Francisco. I think this is such an incredibly valuable conversation to have, especially when it comes to a local level emergency management organization with whose charge is to make sure that the populace that we serve has the information that they need to be safe during an emergency event. I think one of the biggest challenges that someone in my position faces during a disaster or emergency response is being able to recognize misinformation quickly. Rumor control has always been one of the main priorities of an emergency operations center activation, specifically within the Joint Information Center, which is where all emergency public information is coordinated and created and disseminated. But having the ability to recognize something quickly so that we can demystify or debunk it and address it quickly is really pivotal. When I think back on the legacy of misinformation and its long-term effects, I was reminded of that medical study that was erroneous and false that was published in a respected medical journal that linked vaccines to autism, and the many years and generations of people who maybe opted out of vaccines, much to the detriment of their children's health and the broader health community. The long-term effects can be disastrous, and especially in a disaster situation when it's confusing and people are scared and looking for that trusted source of information. I think it's incredibly important to have this conversation before the stressful event so that we can think of strategies to mitigate this misinformation, and so that we can ensure that the populations that we serve can be safe during a disaster. So again, thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to learn from my fellow panelists, and also take perspectives or share perspectives from the local level, boots on the ground, so to speak, when it comes to how we can communicate with people during a disaster so they know how to be safe. Thank you. And I think next, I'm sorry, Megan, I'm not sure who's next, so I'll leave it to you.
It is me. So thank you so much, Kristen. I am so delighted to be part of this important conversation. Thank you so much for having me. I am Dr. Kim Cloca McLean, and my background is in both meteorology and risk decision sciences. I'm a senior social scientist supporting the National Weather Service. And today I'm going to share some thoughts from the perspective of contemporary social science research in this area that I've been involved in. So, another caveat, as CNA did earlier, I'll do this for myself. I'm not officially representing the National Weather Service in these remarks. For better or worse, you love or hate my remarks, they are my own. So my research has explored the use of weather forecast information to inform decisions by individuals, communities, emergency management, and broadcast media. And my interest in this discussion is to focus on what we internally call the communication ecosystem for weather. Many voices have long been part of communicating critical weather information. The Weather Service forecast is almost completely mediated by other communicators in this space. Few people get their information directly from the government. There's always been some degree of tension, therefore, about what constitutes an official forecast message and what each voice in the system contributes to improving or degrading disaster outcomes. Modern communication technology has vastly expanded the field of communication, decentralizing messaging and introducing people with very different backgrounds into the mix of weather communicators. The general trend has been from trained physical scientists to individuals that represent the disaster subcultures of different places who are able to use various techniques to get attention. Any given day, a new weather star can be born. One of the most followed weather communicators that we know of now gained their following by broadcasting during a historic tornado outbreak across the Mid South, a place that's not typically covered as well by traditional broadcast media, in December of 2021. And they leveraged this to quickly build a strong and enthusiastic following. And now their reach and influence far surpasses any individual meteorologist that exists within the traditional communication system. And they don't have meteorology training. And so it's a new world that we're living in. I'll discuss in the remarks to come some ongoing efforts to navigate these challenges and to consider even what is mis or disinformation when it comes to weather forecasting. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dawn Thomas. I'm going to give you a little background so that you know kind of throughout the next roughly hour and a half where I'm coming from. So for 20 years, I've been at CNA, and I walk this line between emergency management and homeland security. I focus on planning, response, and then also reviews of all types of disasters. So Megan rattled off a few in the beginning, but hurricanes, trains, wildfires, cyber attacks, human and disease outbreaks, human and animal disease outbreaks. So a very wide range. Before that, I was getting my master's in Israel in terrorism and looking at the terrorism campaign before Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. So very kind of different things I was doing. And then before that, when I was an undergrad at Carnegie Mellon, which I'm going to shout out, of course, I was focusing on poli-sci, but I had sociology and theater minors. So what this all led to, other than my mom having a heart attack that I would never get a job, is it's an odd mix of looking at disaster with that kind of human side involved. And it's also led to kind of an overactive imagination, which serves me well when I put my homeland security hat on. So given all those things, what I'm really fascinated by is the intersections of things, right? And so when you look at hurricanes, right, they're getting worse. They are less predictable. They intensify rapidly. It's happening in places that, maybe hasn't had one before, right? So that's going on. But at the same time, you have this like rise of social media, right? It's everywhere. Better available data, which is great, and capability to process things faster, which is both great and can be less great, right? So these things converging have had some amazing opportunities, but then also some downsides. And one of the downsides I see is mis and disinformation. So I'm really glad we're talking about it today. In context of a hurricane is a great way to think about it. And I'm really glad that this panel is happening and that we have the folks on that we do. With that, I will hand it over to Heidi.
Hi, thanks, Dawn. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this very timely and important conversation today. As Meg mentioned, I'm a senior research scientist in CNA's China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division. And I've spent my nearly 18 years at CNA looking at China's propaganda and influence operations around the world. What is a China propaganda specialist doing in a conversation about emergency management and hurricane season, you might ask? Uh, the short answer to that is because Beijing exploits natural disasters as propaganda opportunities to undermine trust in the US government, both domestically and internationally. Uh, Beijing views itself as engaged in I see a cat, in a battle for influence with the West. And it routinely takes advantage of any opportunity to chip away at the United States image by making our government look weak, divided, or inept. It's been nearly 20 years since Katrina, but Chinese state-run media continues to churn out propaganda criticizing the US response. Just earlier this year, China's state-run international broadcaster CGTN released a documentary portraying the government's response to Katrina as an example of racial inequality and human rights abuses in the United States. Why bring up Katrina now? Why do they keep bringing it up? Well, propaganda pieces like that are usually timed to deflect US criticism of China's human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Tibet, and to portray the United States as hypocritical. It's the nation state version of I know you are, but what am I? And the use of propaganda like this to shape foreign perceptions, it's ingrained in the DNA of the Chinese Communist Party. It's been a core part of how they operate for over a century. But, and this is key for the discussion today, their approach to propaganda and influence operations are evolving. As China learns from Russia, and we've increasingly seen it attempt to exploit divisions within American society and spread disinformation, both overtly and covertly, in ways that have the potential to complicate US disaster relief efforts. I'll leave it at there. I'll say a bit more about that later. But again, I'm really heartened that we're including this element in the conversation today.
So I'm going to jump back in and kick us off with our first question. I'd like to actually start with a broader question to give us all a shared sense and understanding perhaps of the scope of the problem. So Andy, I'm going to start with you and ask if you can perhaps share a little bit about what kinds of things we're talking about when we talk about misinformation and disinformation related to hurricanes and sort of extreme weather events more generally.
Well, mis and disinformation comes in all shapes and sizes, and honestly, a lot of it is a distraction. How many of you have seen footage of a shark swimming in someone's basement or down the street after a flood has taken place? Every natural disaster seems to have a certain number of themes that arise each time, with people wanting to share the most outlandish footage, the most outlandish claims, and go viral. Sometimes media taps into that as well, because they're going to get attention too if you show that clip of the shark swimming down the street or in a basement. And that's all well and good, but it's honestly a distraction from the types of mis and disinformation that can be potentially harmful. And that's really the public safety mis and disinformation. If you have people misunderstanding evacuation orders or not understanding the availability of first responders to potentially rescue them, given the storm is in progress, people not understanding what's a likely flood zone, uh, there are very basic things that need to be prioritized for people to understand, because at that moment, it's also a matter of life and death. On top of all that, you've got what's effectively partisan mis and disinformation. Every time you see a hurricane, you'll see people quarreling about climate change. You'll see people arguing about different topics. And again, there's a time and place where professionals and scientists can weigh in on those issues. But the most important matter at hand is making sure that people have the information they need to keep safe and to plan ahead as best as possible, so that access is readily available even before the disaster hits.
Dawn, you want to weigh in on this question as well?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. The most important part of hurricane preparedness and response is, as Andy alluded to, are those things that are about life safety, right? And so when we think about MDM bombarding like citizens all the time, right? It worries me that in a life-threatening situation, it'll cloud the picture of those that are trying to make real decisions real time. I have lots of examples at this point. CNA has been working on a project to support a study on evacuation behavior for FEMA's National Hurricane Program. And, of course, we see the rapid intensification and all the things that make hurricanes a little bit less predictable, happening in places that, that haven't traditionally had one. And meanwhile, these decisions surrounding evacuations are super impactful, right? It's maybe the most impactful decision that someone's going to need to make in a hurricane. And the influence that MDM could have over that decision is actually quite worrisome, right? So especially like if it's an area they've never had a storm before, right? Or this kinds of winds before, and then they're making these decisions. So whether it's like, misinformation where things are just wrong, or it's active disinformation of either something internal that is disagreeing or a nation state, I worry that it drives Americans to make decisions based on bad information. And that's going to have worse outcomes. So when I apply this overactive imagination that I told you about, plus a little bit of recent history thrown in, right, for context, I have a lot of examples how this could play out. There could be pictures of traffic jams that don't exist, which encourage people not to get on the road, for example. Or, emergency managers work all year round to get folks to understand their evacuation zones, using words, using maps, using everything available. A couple of misplaced maps could really confuse people at a time when everything needs to be clear so they know what action to take. Shelters, folks are less likely to go to congregate shelters after COVID, right? It was for all the reasons that you would imagine, right? So you start to put in some misinformation, disinformation about the safety of shelters, and you have more people that decide to shelter in place instead of hitting the road. And while it frightens me all around, it really frightens me for those who are at the lower socioeconomic statuses who depend on public services, like that there'll be gas along the way, that there might be shelters where they can stop. And having those people feel less safe leaving than they do staying home, not because of the situation, but because of the mis and disinformation about the situation.
Andy, thank you. Dawn, thank you. That was a great way to sort of set the scene for the, I think the stakes, not just the scope of the problem, but the stakes that we're really talking about here. So as the second question, with this sort of baseline understanding of what we're talking about and what the stakes are, I want to pivot a little bit to the challenge. And I'm gonna ask Kristen and Kim here to weigh in on the specific challenge that this type of content presents, and why it matters that we have a plan for responding. So Kristen, I'll give it to you first.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Andy and Dawn, for your insightful comments. As the local emergency management member of this panel, this concept of MDM is definitely, I'm going to say it's terrifying. In San Francisco, we don't necessarily have hurricanes, although who knows, considering what had happened relatively recently down in San Diego. But we do live on the world's most active seismic faults, and the inevitability of a damaging earthquake is not a matter of if, but when. So the concept of having misinformation when we are in a situation where it's confusing, we're trying to get a lay of the land. If there's a scenario, for example, like I said, like an earthquake, or even just last year in San Francisco, we had actually it was the March before last, we had winds that actually almost registered as hurricane winds. It happened out of the blue. There was glass that was broken from high rises that was falling down onto the streets. It was unprecedented. And we were trying to figure out how to create public safety messages based on situations that we had not experienced yet. And that was in and of itself a feat. And we didn't necessarily have MDM to have to deal with. So the concept of that kind of intersecting or infiltrating our emergency operations center and our emergency response when it comes to issuing emergency public information. I think having the foresight to think this through in advance is extremely important. You know, when I think about how we approach emergency preparedness in general, it's, you know, what we do before the disaster makes a huge difference afterwards. So when we're in the situation, trying to kind of maneuver through maybe deconflicting information, we're analyzing, you know, potentially rumor control within an EOC setting. We're also getting information from our other sections, which include operations. So that's the first responders who are out on, you know, boots on the ground. They're the ones who are giving us the information that we need to know. They're asking for resources, and that includes telling the public what to do. Then we're also getting direction from policy group members like the mayor, you know, department heads. So within that little nucleus of an EOC activation for a disaster response, the ability to create accurate, coordinated, timely information that the public needs to know to be safe is in and of itself a feat. So I think that we need to think about ways to integrate the possibility of MDM, which it sounds like more of an inevitability, as I referenced to the earthquake, within our emergency management exercises, for example. So thinking of ways that we can really kind of challenge ourselves in a situation, in a consequence-free environment before the situation occurs, so that we can really kind of explore it. I can tell you from my perspective, and I think I can speak for the rest of my peers in the Bay Area, that MDM is not something that we're really talking about at the local level. So I think that's something that really needs to be addressed when it comes to how do we kind of socialize this, for lack of a better term, within the emergency management community that's actually responsible for creating the emergency public information and handling the disaster response. I think that also, and to your point, Andy, about having trusted partnerships that can be partners within the purveyance of information with the media. I think having the media as partners within an emergency response is extremely important, so that we can actually join forces to help to demystify, actually debunk the inaccuracy or the MDM that is happening. And also being able to recognize it quickly is extremely important too, because in many, I'm not sure who among us has worked in an EOC or an emergency operations center setting. I'm sure there's many of us, but sometimes it's definitely real-time information exchange, but we don't always have the immediate glance, like the knowledge of what's happening firsthand. So being able to recognize it quickly so that we can address it and mitigate it is extremely important. And I think it's also important to begin to educate the general populace about this as part of emergency preparedness. So being able to think about how maybe somebody who is vulnerable to information online, because perhaps they're an older adult, they're not as savvy when it comes to recognizing something that just seems ridiculous, for example, like a shark swimming in someone's basement, for example. So how we can help to engage those of us who may be able to help recognize the risk that other people may have when it comes to understanding truth and untruth in an emergency situation. So I think there's a lot of ways to explore it from a strategic communication standpoint, through preparation and trying to really kind of deconstruct it in a way that is productive and can be integrated into emergency response plans, especially with emergency public information before the actual emergency occurs.
Kim, I'm actually going to jump in for just a second. So Kristen, thank you so much for that. I want to clarify, a couple people have asked about what MDM is. So MDM stands for misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Misinformation is information that's inaccurate, but it's not spread maliciously. So you can think of this as false information that your great Uncle Curtis sends to you. He's trying to be helpful, but he's sending you inaccurate information. Disinformation is inaccurate information, but it is spread maliciously. So in this case, we're thinking more in the category of what Heidi referenced. So false narratives spread by China or by Russia. Malinformation is true information that is spread with the goal of hurting people. So you can think of this as things that are released about political candidates as election day approaches, or putting someone's email address or home address online to make them feel threatened. So misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. I'm sorry I didn't sort of start out with that. We perhaps should have done that. But so Kim, over to you now.
Thank you. I benefited too from understanding those distinctions from your perspective. And again, coming at this from the weather communication, weather social science community, some of the ways we connect to this, I mean, this conversation matters so much to us because our mission is to inform decisions for the protection of life and property. To properly inform the decisions people are making, information needs to be as clear and free of conflict as possible from the multitude of sources that are contributing in that communication ecosystem. Mis and disinformation then can fundamentally challenge our mission success. So a couple specific things I think about. Forecasting lends itself to mis and disinformation because we're looking to the future and there's always uncertainty. So what is mis or disinformation when we're talking about something that hasn't even happened? Often what you're talking about is just people who have different kinds of risk tolerances who are attending to different parts of the possibility spectrum. So defining even the distinction between mis and disinformation is an interesting question to me. In our field, most of what we can do is really just discuss what's more or less likely to occur. Now, warnings are a special type of forecast that carries some authority, but that's just a fraction of the total weather forecast information out there. And there's still uncertainty under the hood of a warning. It's hard enough for Weather Service to speak coherently as an agency composed of many forecasters, some working at the national level and others focusing on local levels. If you were to poll any two meteorologists, they're likely to give you slightly different estimates of what the future portends. So the reality of our information system is that there is already some latent disagreement, some variability to the messaging that goes on, even from within. We're working toward a future where we don't just focus on producing one single vision of what could occur, what we call a deterministic forecast, but we try to give a better sense of the realistic potential range of outcomes that might resolve some of what is perceived to be mis and disinformation, because you could see some people are just focusing on the worst case scenario for earnest reasons. So there's that, but there's also the potential that could be leveraged for disinformation. We want to do this because it's a better telling of the forecast story. People can plan for the range of scenarios, and our science tells us that it would improve the way individuals make decisions for themselves and their communities. But if we do finally get there, the motivations people have, if there's the disinformation motivation, we have to be careful how we disseminate this stuff. It could be really, really easy for people to become confused and lose trust altogether if the pages of the forecast story are ripped and strewn everywhere without context. It could become very easy for nefarious actors to pull this information selectively to make people lose sense of what could most reasonably occur. I'll just wrap up this comment by saying much of our forecasts in the Weather Service are delivered to the public through intermediaries, that mediation I talked about earlier. We formulated relationships with our core partners, including traditional broadcast media, to help streamline our messaging and try to resolve some of these even internal messaging conflicts. We've long known that forecasts aren't just technologies or technical outputs, they're social processes. They're created and disseminated by people. And increasingly, people are turning to self-made individuals on social media to get that weather information. I think we have to be thoughtful about this. The balloon may swell so large as to break. When we are talking about threats from within, I think we need to consider the very existence of social media as, it's a facilitator of dissemination of weather information, great, but it's also a potential threat to the cohesiveness of voice that would most effectively inform people. And it has just complicated our mission success enormously.
No, thank you very much for that, Kim. I think you sort of rightly point out that there's another kind of information out there, which is just inaccurate information, right? Sometimes we'll get it wrong, right? So experts get it wrong sometimes. And then the other kind of information you're kind of drawing attention to is ambiguous information, right? Where we have a range of possibilities and we can't definitively say So if you mix the misinformation and the disinformation and the inaccurate information and the ambiguous information, you can see how you would have a real problem on the consumer side. That it would be that when Kristen thinks about sort of communicating out, she would be trying to cut through an extraordinary amount of sort of swirling content. I'm gonna before I move on to the next question, just a quick reminder to share any questions you have. We're keeping an eye on that, and we'll be sort of pivoting to questions from the group at the end. But I want to add another dimension to this issue. So we've been talking about mis and disinformation as it relates to extreme weather events, and I think we've been talking about lots of kinds of mis and disinformation. To some degree, we're not really thinking specifically about coordinated attempts to spread misinformation or disinformation, so much as I think we're imagining more organic content swirling coming from lots of different sources. And but I want to pivot a little bit to think about coordinated attacks, where there's sort of a pernicious and intentional desire to sort of undermine important communications, right? And communications that I think, as Andy and Dawn rightly pointed out, can endanger people's lives. So Heidi, and then I'll go to Andy after that. Can you speak a little bit about how foreign actors like China take advantage of the sort of confusion and panic and crisis in a moments following hurricanes and other natural disasters?
Sure. Of course, I'm going to default to focusing on China, though Russia and others have certainly exploited natural disasters as well. And I'll mention that. But I mentioned Katrina earlier. There have been other instances depending on how you define natural disaster. I'm going to focus on a couple of recent ones because they tell us about how China in particular is evolving, and they hint at what we might expect in the future. I'm going to start by stretching the category of natural disasters to include COVID. China's propaganda response to COVID is relevant here for a few reasons. First, it was an instance in which China sought to deflect US and international criticism by making the US look bad. This is a standard tactic. Chinese media relentlessly criticized the US response to the pandemic, highlighting death counts, accusing the US government of failing to contain the spread, and contrasting this with China's lockdown. Second, China's response to questions about how Beijing handled the pandemic was to seize on a fringe conspiracy theory that COVID-19 originally came from a US military lab in Fort Detrick. The interesting thing about this is that that theory actually existed in the US social media ecosystem. Chinese media and officials found it, it bubbled up, and seized on it and sought to make it mainstream. This was one of the first times that we had seen them do that. This was an evolution in behavior. And third, this was one of the first times that we saw China push out patently false information on a global scale. In the past, Chinese media would kind of cherry pick facts. They'd seek to drown out inconvenient narratives, but they typically refrained from inventing truths. I think, and this is speculation on my part, on some level, they worried about the reputational cost of being caught in a lie. But they watched the Russians do it and realized that China could get away with it too. So COVID was really a watershed moment in their approach to information operations. And it foreshadowed what was to come. And that brings me to late last summer during the Hawaii wildfires. This was an instance in which we observed China seek to complement its state-run media propaganda, which of course was churning out criticism of the US response to the fires. But they complemented it with this covert social media campaign. And that campaign was notable for a couple of reasons. First, it pushed another conspiracy theory. There were accounts that Microsoft and others attributed back to China that were pushing the narrative on social media that the fires were not, in fact, natural. They were really caused by a secret weather weapon that the US military was testing. And second, that campaign employed generative AI. The posts that Chinese accounts made across a variety of platforms included photographs and experts assess that these photographs were generated by AI programs. And as far as I know, this was one of the first times that we had seen China use that particular tool in a disinformation campaign. And it's unlikely to be the last. The good news for now is that those posts didn't seem to gain a lot of traction or inspire a lot of audience engagement. Uh, but as with COVID, this is a harbinger of things to come. They're learning, they're experimenting, they're evolving, they're doing it opportunistically when there's a natural disaster. Um, as an aside, I said I would focus on China, but Russia also exploited the Maui wildfires by spreading posts that emphasized, the United States is spending so much money on the war in Ukraine, and that would be better spent fighting these wildfires and on disaster relief. So I'll conclude with the thought that U.S. adversaries like China and Russia are actively seeking to, exacerbate the impact of all kinds of disasters in the U.S., including natural ones. And they're learning and getting more sophisticated at it over time. This is just part of our operating environment now. And knowing that means that we can plan for it.
Thanks, Heidi. Andy, did you want to chime in?
Sure. I'm really glad Heidi brought up COVID because honestly, COVID was was a moment of clarity for a lot of people who previously had not been paying attention to influence operations, malign influence campaigns. Russia's got a long history in this. Some credit Stalin with coming up with the term disinformation decades ago. There's, in some ways, what's old is new again because Russia is very opportunistic. And in the case of COVID, for the first 6 weeks or so, they, in some ways, they kind of sat back and watched what narratives naturally started to rise through conspiracy theories. So, for example, the Fort Detrick narrative came up pretty quickly. You started seeing people talk about biolabs and bioweapons. That would then lead to um, uh, fringe pundits that would appear on air on Russian TV, people that had no credibility but would be presented as if they did. They would comment on one of these rumors and say, "Oh, it's quite likely this is what happened," and then you'd see from there. Russian mainstream media, which is effectively state media, picks up those quotes and circulates them and normalizes that information. And so it's really throwing spaghetti at the wall. They'll share all sorts of crazy things that are being said, but all it takes is one or two of those things to really stick to ultimately cause chaos and confusion. And with Russia, their main goal always is to sow chaos and mistrust domestically within the US and between the US and its partners around the world, which is why, as COVID progressed, you saw what you sometimes see in hurricanes and other natural disasters, Russia mocking local and national response by talking about how Russia is better organized at pulling together a vaccine and that the US vaccine efforts aren't working out. Uh, I remember on one occasion, Russian media showed footage of these giant cargo planes that they said were being filled with medical supplies and that were prepared to deliver them to the EU in the US as needed in case their governments aren't able to handle it. And so it's effectively trolling at that point. Uh, but it's they'll look for whatever advantage they have to cause that division to be sowed within online communities and between communities in general. You very much saw that in the 2016 election, where Russia had fake social media accounts that were partisan in nature that would start arguments with each other, and those would lead to arguments among actual partisans in the U.S. And so all of these scenarios are ripe for the picking, and Russia sees this as a vast playbook that they can enact when they need to, but they have also done such a good job over the last decade sowing mistrust that in many cases they can just sit back and watch domestic mis and disinformation rise organically and let that go viral instead, because it's so much harder to inoculate ourselves against mis and disinformation when it's coming from inside the house.
Andy, thank you. So I think Andy and Heidi have painted, yeah, I don't know, a terrifying picture of coordinated mis and disinformation campaigns with just for potentially really high stakes. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the impacts of that. So I'm going to pose this question to Kim and Dawn. So from your perspectives, does it matter if the information, the mis and disinformation, does it matter where it's coming from, right? If it's domestic, if it's organically circulating rumors, if it's a coordinated effort by a foreign actor, does it matter where it's coming from? Are you worried about one kind more than another? Should we be worried about one kind more than another? And I think I'll go to Kim first this time.
Yeah, this is such an interesting thing for me to think about and an interesting conversation. I honestly don't know if I can say that we in the weather space are particularly worried about one over the other. I think what we have centered on most is nefarious versus earnest motivations. People with earnest motivations can be pulled into processes that help us sort out what's reasonable and try to do what's best for people. Those who are out to intentionally mislead or who are just out to gain followers and attention, whether internal or foreign, they'll have possibly the same kind of deleterious effect on informed decision making. And thus far, I know I've really focused on challenges for decision making ahead of an event. This is sort of the space that, weather forecasting mostly, this is where we contribute in the disaster life cycle. But this also affects meteorologists' ability to generate a good forecast. We rely on the public for reports of what's going on the ground so we can issue good warnings and so we can develop an accurate climatology of what hazards have happened where. And that climatology then feeds into all kinds of decisions later on for recovery, insurance claims, and on and on. There are internal mechanisms we've developed for forecast offices to help one another, to vet reports, because fake reports are so very common. We can't even tell you where they're coming from, whether internal, so-called internal to the US probably, or external. This was happening before social media, but social media has amplified it exponentially. And we are really relying on having some ground truth to make every part of our decisions and report faithfully on what has happened to communities. So I think I'll just return to the point. What we are really concerned about is the motivation and whether somebody can be brought into our processes, or if we need to just work on trying to negate those voices that would aim to disrupt faithful reporting.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Kim. When it comes to misinformation, it's the muddying of the waters. It absolutely is detrimental, and it challenges people like Kristen who are trying to get like good information to the right people in time for them to make good decisions. Hugely challenging. But I do worry more about disinformation being used from an adversary, right? A thinking adversary is making decisions and aiming the kind of tool at hand, right? The mis and the disinformation kind of in a way that's more strategic in nature, right? And they're doing it to erode trust, to stir up serious social divides, right? But then also to potentially get people to do things that make them and those around them less safe, right? That would be the goal of perhaps an adversary's use of misinformation during a hurricane. So if I put on for a moment my kind of Homeland Security analyst hat, and also a little bit of erring on the side of caution, right? And again, the active imagination. I have to believe that when it comes to adversaries like China, Russia, they have a pretty good picture of what our hurricane response plans, like our playbooks, look like. We typically do the same things. We send the same resources. We talk about the same issues. And I have to believe that that's known at this point. And if it's not, it's knowable, right? So you add that to somebody who can target their disinformation at vulnerabilities that they see that we might have. And maybe even the future steps that we're about to take to make people more safe, that worries me more than just misinformation and the noise and the clutter that will put forth. And then if we really want to get like kind of nervous and go under our beds at night, when I think about mis and disinformation, and mostly disinformation kind of combined with an attack, right? We're talking about naturally occurring and taking advantage. But if we talk about a cyber attack on our critical infrastructure, for example, or going back to hurricanes, like even how we communicate during hurricanes, attacking our communication systems, that threat's significant enough for us to be paying attention to if and exactly how it gets used for the hurricane season, this one and the ones that come, so that maybe we have a little bit of insight how it might get used in the future for more direct attacks, like a cyber attack. I think if we don't take advantage of what we learn now through something about taking advantage of something that's already happened, we lose the opportunity to think strategically about the disinformation being used against us when it's a more deliberate type of attack from an adversary.
Fantastic. Those are both of your sets of comments were really fantastic, and I think well, I don't know, Dawn, your overactive imagination is making me anxious. Kim, did you want to respond to Dawn?
I just love everything that Dawn was saying, and it's so great that we look at this from such different perspectives. And I can so resonate with the point that the nefarious actor, if they're looking at things strategically, they could find ways to be more damaging because they're doing things with that intent to harm. I wonder if we know a whole lot about which kind actually does cause more harm. This is a question I guess I'll just turn to the panel. Maybe we can contemplate it as we go forward into our broader Q&A session. But it's been my observation in the weather space that a lot has already gone on to be very distracting and to cost, to dent trust and to cause people to even, make evacuation decisions just based on those people who are putting out like the extended range forecast. People love to go to our models and pull the most bombastic single, model thing for so far out in the future that it's fanciful, not scientifically rigorous, to believe in it at all. And it's like a 10-day out forecast for a hurricane landfall, and get whole communities spun up to, potentially be hit by this thing. And there have been times where things have actually started and costs have been incurred because of just that. And I contrast that against the stuff I see that's from these malign foreign actors, and it tends to be like it resonates less. And I think this is something you guys have talked about, like there's not been as much necessarily that it intentionally does catch on. So I have a question there about, maybe it's not intentional, but it could be that people who are just self-interested, and they're doing it because they're trying to get attention, actually have a worse effect than someone who's strategically trying to hurt us. And I would just love to hear reflections on what might be known about the effects of those things in comparison to one another.
Andy, any chance I can
Sure. I think we know a pretty decent amount about how that works because it's a lot more effective if you can identify useful idiots to present your case or to sow discord than to share information in a way that makes it flagrantly obvious it's coming from a state actor. And so uh, the, you'll see Russia go out of its way to encourage influencers to share information about certain things to effectively get them on their side. I mean, that doesn't mean they're being spies or anything. It's often just people who have some sort of political grudge, see an alignment with what Russia is sharing, and they'll start spouting off that same information. And because those individuals have large followings, or they often do, it becomes red meat for those audiences. And emotion will always trump facts when people are struggling to process information. And I think uh, if I were a malign actor at a government, I would rather find someone who's part of those communities who can rally the troops in a way that's strategic for me than trying to do it myself. By laundering it through those communities, it really makes it feel like it's purely local in nature or regional in nature. And often it is organic, but you can still exploit that.
No, I think that's right, and the implications for someone like Kim or Kristen, right? So Kristen trying to communicate in the moment of a crisis, um, the implications are pretty significant, right? Not just in terms of having to directly correct false information that could sort of put people in harm's way, but also in terms, I think, of protecting. The more information that is out there, the more people feel overwhelmed by information, and the harder it is for them to find accurate information. And the sort of people seek information that aligns with what they already believe. We know this because of the research on confirmation bias, and all of those things degrade Kristen's credibility as a speaker in a moment of a crisis where people may not turn to her anymore because and that makes it harder for Kristen to get her message out, or those folks that are in Kristen's position. So I'm going to ask the super hard question now, and I want to flag for the rest of our panelists that there are sort of a couple of questions in the chat, and many of them are asking you to solve this problem. So those questions are coming your way. You could take a quick look at the questions if you want to kind of give yourself a preview. But I'm going to ask those questions of you, and apparently in about 3 to 5 minutes, you're going to solve this problem for the audience who has high expectations. But right now, I want to sort of give Kristen and Andy a chance to maybe talk a little bit about mitigation efforts, right? So Kristen, from the perspective of someone who does communication, is actually out there trying to communicate in the midst of these crises, and Andy as someone who sort of studied these phenomenons more recently. So the question I want to ask is, we know there's no perfect solution, right? But Kristen, when you sort of think about how you're communicating, has this challenge changed how you're communicating at all? Are there things that you do now in an effort to kind of help ensure that your message gets through sort of all the noise? What are the things you think about doing to make sure that your message lands with the right people?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm not sure I'll be able to sleep tonight after this discussion, but there's several thoughts that I have. And this is actually a question, I think, for the broader group, but in general, when I go back to my leadership after this discussion, I'm going to want to know, how are we getting the intelligence filtered down to the local level about what potentially could be nefarious information? And this is a little bit in the operational sense, but every big city or region has a fusion center where there's intelligence officers, there's FBI and so forth. So how are we going to flag that kind of consideration within those resources for us at the local level? So that's maybe more of a rhetorical question, but that's something I want to kind of even think through with my leadership about how we can know what's happening. But when it comes to the actual sort of, when we're in the moment, it can be very complicated to make sure that we are coordinated. And in a joint information center, I can give you the most basic meaning of it. And it's so that if the police department is saying evacuate and the fire department is saying shelter in place, the JIC's job is to deconflict that and make sure that we are saying the right thing and it's accurate and it's coordinated. So I think having the right entities within the emergency response that can actually speak to the accuracy of the situation, whether it's, like I said, boots on the ground, first responders. I think about evacuation routes, or the examples that Dawn brought up about images that made, it seemed like there was like some sort of a zombie apocalypse, traffic jam, how we can actually have the intelligence there to actually just in the moment deconflict it, and coming up with communication strategies that potentially could include maybe even just in like can you take a video of yourself, Mr. Firefighter, who's there on the scene, send it to us in the EOC and the JIC so that we can start to mass broadcast that, so we can actually start to just really, and it feels almost like rudimentary about how we can actually dispel this with truth, but it's also, that takes time too. So time is of the essence in these situations, when especially we want people to be able to act quickly, but also to do the right thing. It's not as easy as it might seem. I think that also that we need to have some support when it comes to other elements of the emergency response, when it comes to how we integrate potentially, in San Francisco, our emergency response plan is based on ESFs. And for those of you in the emergency management community that might sound familiar, the ESF that my role is in is ESF 15, which is the Joint Information System, which is where we generate the emergency public information. But in San Francisco, we created a new ESF based just entirely on cybersecurity, cyber threat. So I'm also wondering if there's ways that we can integrate considerations within that ESF 17 that kind of brings in some of the coordination from a cybersecurity component to help us in the JIC, because we as public information officers are the ones that are tasked with purveying or relaying the emergency public information. We're only as good as the information that we're given, so we have a limited vision or scope of what we can actually harness. So it's incredibly important for us to be able to do our jobs successfully and well by getting the accurate information too, without having us to try and spin our wheels, try and figure it out. We have positions in place that we're always monitoring social media, traditional media, so that we have enhanced situational awareness. And there are times that we actually might see something within the JIC, within that EOC setting, before, say, our operations section does, and others, so that we can actually filter that information as well. But again, we need to have a unified front of aggregators of information to help us dispel the inaccurate information. Because again, what makes my hair stand up is, how are we going to recognize this MDM or this misinformation, malinformation, disinformation quickly, and be able to understand what's happening so that we can pivot immediately? It almost escalates into more of a crisis communications component beyond just emergency public information, which is, go this way, shelter in place, whatever. It's almost like it's more like, those are the good old days of emergency public information in some ways. And then you add that layer of just nefarious, whether it's well-intended or nefarious, it changes the landscape of emergency public information. So I have a lot to chew on.
Andy, do you want to speak a little bit to this challenge?
Sure. In the same way that we practice disaster preparedness, I think we need to practice narrative preparedness. And that may seem extremely daunting, because how do you predict mis and disinformation? Well, what you do is, if you're a community that is vulnerable to certain types of natural disasters, look at the types of situations that keep you up at night. What are the points of confusion that you've seen happen in the past, or could identify as happening, that can cause people to make poor choices? You want to effectively game out those scenarios, and rather than wait to respond to them, you should be able to start communicating immediately what people need to be understanding in order to be better prepared. We sometimes talk about the need to debunk mis and disinformation, and it's something fact checkers around the world do all the time. But debunking anything is defensive in nature. Something is already out there in the ether that's potentially causing problems, and the chances of your response circulating as well as the original claim usually isn't great. So if you can get ahead of those pieces of mis and disinformation, and start having conversations with constituents, with community groups, with media, so they can communicate with the public and identify the sorts of things where information begins to fall apart, and when that can cause potentially life or death situations. You need to be able to inoculate the public against making poor decisions during a crisis, and that has to be done as a form of preparedness. The last thing I'll say on that is I think it's really important to acknowledge what you know and what you don't know. To um, uh, acknowledge that you don't have the answers always. And I think, if you look at weather forecasting, of course, a meteorologist is not going to say that they know with any assurance what is going to happen 10 days from now. We need to remind the public that that's how meteorology works. We need to be able to remind people that we don't know exactly how the storm's going to hit and who's going to have the first problems within the community. But you can make educated guesses. If you communicate to the public that you are sharing information based on all the known information you have with a certain margin of error, then the public will be more likely to trust what you're saying. Whereas if you only communicate when you know absolutely for sure what's going on, there may be opportunities where people can be told, we're not sure what's going on, so hang on here for a moment while we figure this out, because our lives may depend on it if we don't.
Dawn, I think you wanted to chime in on this conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I do think about like not presenting a problem without presenting some ideas about mitigation. So I want to foot stomp. Kristen mentioned fusion centers. All states have one. Some have more than one. Some have several, like California. And I know that many of them are doing work on identifying malinformation, using both kind of subject matter expertise, but also tools. So if you are not plugged into your fusion center, that is a good place to go to see if you can get some help with identifying the misinformation so that you can kind of get it at its earliest stage. Andy hit on education, right? That pre-education of, we've had a lot as humans thrown at us over the last 20 years. I know personally my head spins all the time. And that the ways that we take in and understand information are changing, right? So we have to educate people about that kind of changing, rapidly coming at us information and how to see it so that we are not spreaders of things that aren't true, whether that's from a nation state or from our Aunt Mabel, right? So education, I think, is critical. The other thing I will say is kind of putting pressure on our tech and our private sector to help us with tools that everyone can have access to that help you identify misinformation, disinformation more readily, or at least flag things for a human to look at so that we can cut through the noise and be able to see things that might be coming from IP addresses outside the country or that are spreading in a way that looks suspicious, right? That if the technology can be used against us, we can also use it to protect us. And I would kind of encourage all of us to implore private sector to give us those tools to help us. And then Andy also mentioned that I saw in action, finding those common threads that come up every time something happens, right? Every time you talk about sending people to a shelter or shelters, the subject of immigrants comes up, right? Like, who will be there? How will they check and make sure that they're safe? Or parolees or sex offenders, right? This comes up every time. And they're all, especially with the sex offenders, they're all kind of valid concerns about going to a shelter. You have an evacuation order, you go to a shelter, you want to make sure that the shelter is safe, right? But if you know that thread comes up every single time, being on the lookout for the rise of any misinformation about that thread and having kind of ready-made answers about what that shelter's processes are for checking the sex offenders registration list, for example, so that you're ready with those common themes that come up every time something happens. And if you ask any emergency manager or, you know, PIO or somebody in your JIC, they will tell you what those common storylines are. So those are the storylines that I think are probably most susceptible to having disinformation start to swirl around them, because as Heidi noted, they're there and then you can take advantage of them. So that's what I would offer out.
And I think we're, okay, Kristen, I think also has some thoughts she wanted to sort of add to this question.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. And Dawn, thank you for your last point about being able to recognize potential threads of common themes or potential misinformation that that could arise. For example, in San Francisco, we are a sanctuary city. So we have had to do a lot of information in advance to make sure that people who may be undocumented and fearful of going to a shelter will know that ICE is not there. And we've had to do proactive communications about that. For example, when there were the wildfires in Sonoma County, we actually had to set up a shelter, an auxiliary shelter in San Francisco because they were at capacity. So we had to do a lot of proactive communications to that community to make sure that they knew that if they came to the shelter, they'd be safe and they would not be, you know, potentially arrested. So thank you for that great tip. I actually was reminded though of how to engage, and this is to Andy's points about the trusted messengers, and in San Francisco, although this was not in a situation, it was a longer term situation because it was the code response. But what we did was we realized that we as the government asking people to do what they needed to do to be safe for COVID, including sheltering in place, but also ultimately getting vaccines and also not socializing. We were not being effective at getting this information out. So what we had to do is we had to let the communities that represent the communities that we were trying to engage lead the communications. So we did community-led campaigns that made sure that the people that were telling those who we were trying to reach, those potentially most at risk and vulnerable to the effects of COVID, they were hearing the information that they needed to do, what they needed to do to be safe from their peers, from their community. So having those relationships in place is something that we're always trying to expand upon in San Francisco. And one other component of the EOC structure that we are building out is we actually have a whole community branch within operations where we have these partnerships with these community-based serving organizations who can help us in the preparedness space by kind of engaging. We're building these relationships so that when we are in the emergency, we can actually turn to them as the purveyors of information. And we're hoping that having those relationships and the dialogue in place when we're not in an emergency situation, so that when we can turn to them when we are, even when we have a heat emergency, we've actually been able to use this relationship to great benefit to the community as well. So that's one thing I wanted to impart upon. So, but it's definitely a journey, not a destination when it comes to how we can really reach the communities through through those that they trust the most.
And notably, Heidi noting that the challenge will continue to evolve, right? So that China will evolve its strategies, but so will people sort of in the United States, right? And so the minute Kristen figures out how to crack this nut, it will become a different kind of a nut. I think actually that was really fantastic. We kind of like we did a full turn around the room almost, and you actually spoke to a bunch of the questions. I think Kim actually wants to come back and add a couple more additional thoughts and more directly respond to another question.
Yeah, I see, Jose Patino, your question in the chat that you've raised about why people go to different channels to, that aren't necessarily weather experts to get this information. How do we think about this? And I want to reflect on some of the things that were raised by other panelists are really important to consider when addressing your questions. So something that Dawn noted is such a part of this. We have rapidly evolving situations in weather. It's always an evolving forecast discussion. So it's sort of what Andy referred to as, a narrative, a kind of narrative preparedness that we need to formulate. And when I think about the motivations that bring people into those other kinds of people who are narrating different parts of the story or different kinds of stories, I think part of it is we don't do a great job with transparently communicating what we know and don't know. And Andy and Dawn, you both reflected some of this. We often give what are called deterministic forecasts, where it's a single vision of here's our best estimate of what's likely to occur. But forecasters very often know that there's an array of potential outcomes. And you know, there's a lot of consternation about, can we actually provide this information and have people look at us and not just say, you're just like, you like, why do we pay you people? I mean, that is something that is tough for forecasters to handle. The social science that we're developing is quite clear. People actually do love and appreciate that information. It's transparent. But what I see these other actors doing is where we have our sort of best guess forecast, they will go out and look for those worst case scenarios, cull them and pull them out, and people attend to those because they think, oh, the government's hiding something from me, or you know, there's a whole lot under there. I think we need to learn more about the motivations that bring people to that. But in terms of narrative preparedness, I do see that that is a key theme that gets a lot of attention, is those scenarios. And so if we can properly describe like the forecast uncertainty and the array of what's possible, we can probably do a lot to increase our trust, but also to, like, whether they want us to or not, pull those actors sort of into our message by giving them context and saying, you know, yeah, there is some chance out there and we're monitoring X, Y, or Z. But you know, here's where things will start to become clear, credible, just anticipating that. I love that idea of narrative preparedness and thinking about where we're going with communicating the uncertainty of the forecast better as a part of narrative preparedness.
Kim, that's fantastic. I'm actually going to toss it over to Andy for a second. He said he wanted to kind of add a little bit to this, but before I do that, there are a couple folks who have their hands raised. We're not actually able to call on you in this format, so if you could just put your question into the chat, the Q&A, that would be fantastic. So Andy, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So Kim was commenting on a question from Jose regarding why is it that people go to social media first and continue to go to social media? Well, that's what they trust because that's where their community's at. It really boils down to that. You may be uh, an agency within your community, but you're still seen as part of the government, part of the system. And given the world that we live in right now is so mistrustful of any sort of public institution, people are going to seek out like-minded individuals that are going to support their beliefs, present themselves in a way that they seem to understand each other and listen to each other. And that's one of the reasons why conspiracy theories have taken hold so much on social media, because people are vulnerable. They seek out communities that that can help fill a hole in their lives, and there are people who want to exploit that. And so it's just the nature of social media that people congregate in the communities they want to spend time with. So think about how to make the most of it. Identify who the influencers are in your community. Are there a group of weather nerds in your jurisdiction who are regularly sharing footage of something? Bring them together, have a conversation with them, see if they're willing to share information as you can pass it along in certain situations. You can always identify sources within the community online that have a lot of influence, that actually want advice and they want to hear facts. They're willing to work with you. So don't necessarily think of these online communities as all being adversarial. They want to help their audiences too, and because you're serving the same audience, it's the community you live in. So that's, I think, the best you can do is recognize the communal nature of social media and think about how that ultimately relates to the community you live in.
That's fantastic. I think we've heard a little bit now about sort of narrative preparedness. I think some of what Andy has referenced here is recognizing that this content sort of moves through communities, and those communities can be engaged. I'm gonna toss it to Heidi, I think, who wanted to speak a little bit to some of the questions about sort of advice on strategies for helping to kind of combat this kind of content, and then over to Kristen for a different question from our audience.
Thanks, Meg. Yeah, so someone in the chat asked about warning and preparedness to deal with the misinformation threat during a disaster. And Andy, Kim, you guys have talked about narrative preparedness. And I will say that with respect to China, they're pretty predictable in their narratives, right? They're evolving, but right now, for the most part, they're extraordinarily predictable. And the best defense is inoculation. You can prepare people to see these types of narratives and then to question them. The idea that the wildfires are somehow the U.S. military's fault, right? It's a similar threat and similar theme to COVID really came from Fort Detrick. And you can generally predict these things, get ahead of them, and say, if you see something like this, you might question it. And that leads to my other thought, which is the importance of media literacy training and education on this topic. Dawn, you've mentioned it, but regardless of whether the narrative's coming from an adversary, your great uncle Curtis, a little bit of education can go a long way in teaching people to question, to recognize that this information's out there, that their friends and family might be unintentionally spreading it. And as the mom of a 12-year-old who just got a phone, the first thing I tell her is that all media is designed to influence you in some way. So if you see something in one place, look for 2 or 3 other sources of information and compare, and develop trusted sources of information, right? This is something that a lot of us in the room as analysts are trained to do, but now, given the information, the super messy information environment that we live in, we need to teach our kids how to do that too. I'll stop there, but those are my thoughts on preparedness and the ways to respond.
No, that's fantastic addition to the conversation, Heidi. Kristen, I'm going to toss it to you. There's a question that's directed at you, which is, Kristen, how has San Francisco emergency management approached involving elected officials in accurate information distribution during emergencies? Are there any best practices you could recommend?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. And by the way, Heidi, I love your point about digital media literacy. That's going to be one of my takeaways to think about how we can integrate that into our emergency preparedness and public information and education. But to go back to the question about electeds, electeds can be you're a friend or a not so much of a friend if you don't engage them in the right way. So in San Francisco, it's pivotal for us to make sure that we consider our electeds as part of the extension of our ability to share information with the public. So they are partners in purveying emergency public information. They also are able to give us information from the communities that they represent, whether it's resource needs or cultural considerations. Maybe we're not, hitting the mark when it comes to how messages might be resonating with their communities. So in short answer, just involve your elected partners, consider them as partners in the emergency response. Because I think, and although every disaster has the potential to turn political, if you're engaging them at the get-go, which is actually what we did for the COVID command, or for our COVID EOC activation, we actually asked for the board, our elected supervisors who are, they represent certain districts throughout the city, to actually play a role. They actually came and had a position within the EOC, and they actually were in I think I'd referenced the community branch, so they could actually be helping us to get information from the community that they serve in a very hyper local way. And then we could actually integrate that into our overall communications with the broader San Francisco communities that we serve. So include them because they can be a great asset. And if they are excluded, then it could become more of a challenge as well to help to kind of handle the fallout from potential. We're all emotional beings, right? So in stressful situations, we want to make sure that we harness everyone's intentions for good and bring them into the fold. That's how that's what I would recommend.
I'm gonna thank you, Kristen. That was fantastic. Thank you. I'm gonna toss it to Dawn next, but I'm gonna take moderator's prerogative and add a little bit to this conversation about mitigation strategies before I do that. And I want to add sort of two things in particular. We wrote a couple of reports about a year ago, and in the course of doing that, we talked to a number of experts on mis and disinformation, and we had this really fantastic conversation with one expert, and she said, and this is a direct quote, corrections are wildly effective. And so I think it's just sort of worth keeping in mind that it may feel like you're screaming into the void when you're issuing a correction, but the research is actually pretty clear that they're very effective. And then the only other thing I want to sort of add there is that I think also one of the things to keep in mind here is your goal as a communicator is not to respond to all of the disinformation or eliminate it. Right? There's some if you can get if 4 people have received a message and you can convince one of them not to pass it along, the sort of downstream implications of that can be exponentially large, right? So if that person doesn't pass it along, then their followers don't see it, and their followers don't see it, and their followers don't see it. Just by changing one person's mind with a correction, you can actually decrease circulation by thousands. And so I think it's really worth being sort of right-sizing our expectations in this space. We're not going to eliminate the circulation of mis and disinformation during these emergencies. But anything we can do to decrease it can be really powerful and can, given the stakes here, have life-changing and life-saving effects. So Dawn, I'll toss it to you. Dawn, this will be the final question, I think, because we are almost out of time.
Sure. Nadine gave us some background on this question, but it kind of ends with, has anyone figured out how to spread accurate information to communities that might be cut off in the wake of disaster? And when we think about hurricanes, I think this is incredibly relevant, just because of the nature of the winds and the waters and the infrastructure that could be destroyed by those two things. And just where we live as Americans right now, this is a real kind of issue that everyone's dealing with. I did just work a little bit with on the Maui fires, and the public information officers there were saying that they definitely had people that are either cut off because they were more remote, but also just cut off because they don't actually buy into media that you would get your information, and they're not on social media. And they always said it came down to people, right? So those trusted messengers, the pastors, the elders, the people that in the communities that, and this is where it kind of crosses over with, like, you don't need to have the exact right information. You just need to be able to say what information you know versus what information you've heard, and distinguish very carefully, but also just to talk with people and just to get a conversation started. So they would send people out into locations to just get the conversation started. This is what we're hearing. We don't know X, Y, and Z. I will definitely keep you involved as I get more information. But yeah, that there's no technical solution when you're technically cut off. And so they had to use people, and they had to use those trusted messengers that they all knew ahead of time because of the kind of nature of that society. So maybe that's something that you can put in place if you do have an area that does get cut off fairly frequently, or people or groups of people that are not kind of not part of the structures that we've set up on social media, that you have alternate ways to keep them informed. But if you don't have information, at least keep them connected, because there's a difference. But I think the connection is what was super important, at least in the wake of the Maui fires.
So on that sort of fantastic answer to a last question, I think we're gonna wrap up. I want to thank our excellent panelists, and that sentence is written here in my notes, but I really do mean it. You didn't see the behind the scenes, but they kept sending me little messages. I want to chime in on this one. I have something to say about that one. Can I answer this one? And it made this whole event, I think, really seamless and exciting in a way that it could have been just a bunch of talking heads. I really appreciate how everybody engaged with one another. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. The questions were really, really fantastic. And I hope that we were able to get to both of a bunch of them. We're now a few weeks into hurricane season, so I'm going to end with a wish for a quiet year, even though the National Weather Service is predicting the opposite, in which everybody stays happy and healthy. So thank you again so much for joining us, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you all so much.